His interaction with the soldier left Sonny in a dark mood, but he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to enjoy the fresh air. Indeed, air like that was hard to come by in the real world. Microdust and other pollutants made it rough and unpleasant, not to mention the general stench of the outskirts. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked diligently. However, filtered air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very rich had access to truly pleasant breathing. And here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air, like a second-generation elite. At least I've gotten to breathe real air before I die. However, these real-world luxuries were laughably overshadowed by the fact that he was stuck in a chain gang. The cold was dreadful, and his wrists and feet throbbed in agony. The slave caravan slowly dragged itself up the mountain, with more and more slaves stumbling and periodically falling to the ground. A couple of times, those who could not walk anymore were taken off the chain and unceremoniously tossed off the side of the mountain, down into the abyss that loomed to the left of it. Every time it happened, Sonny was powerless to do anything but stand by and watch, his heart a mix of fear and compassion. Poor fellows. Rest in peace, you pitiful souls. Sonny remembered what the older police officer had told him about the humans here. They weren't real. Keeping that in mind, Sonny forced himself to push their suffering out of his mind and focus on preserving his own life. It was a bit strange trying to find things to be happy about in the midst of this disaster of a nightmare. But thankfully, Sonny had time to prepare himself for this eventuality. When the symptoms of the spell first appeared, he did not handle it well. Dying before you even turned 17 was not something one could easily cope with. But in the end, Sonny was surprised how quickly he came to terms with it. He visited his parents' makeshift resting place. Because Sonny was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, their grave marker was just 2 lines carved into an old tree. He added a 3rd line for himself and found a surprising relief in the process. His life had already been full of such relentless suffering that the nightmare spell almost felt like an escape hatch. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, protecting himself, and planning for the future anymore. Once the worst that could happen had already happened, what else was there to fear? He had surrendered to fate and resolved to savor whatever minute joys presented himself. Besides, he knew that cold would not kill him, simply because he had already seen what was awaiting the caravan further up the mountain. The picture of piled bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, a pack of monsters that were going to do the caravan in, and by the look of it, the attack was going to take place in a matter of hours, not days. The nightmare spell hadn't given him any resources, but the insight it provided could be good for something. The foreknowledge was his only hope of escaping this grisly fate, so he had to use it wisely. Sonny decided to take another look at his status and summoned the runes again. The last time, he was too outraged by the aspect and didn't study the attributes well. While not as important as one's aspect, the attributes were often the deciding factor between life and death. They represented one's natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. The runes read, Fated. Attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. Mark of Divinity. Attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, a long time ago. Child of Shadows. Attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own. Sonny didn't know what to make of the unusual collection of attributes. Interesting. He recognized the first attribute, Fated, as the main culprit of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed to indicate that he was destined for a certain fate, To die miserably and vanish without trace, for example. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated actually just meant that improbable things had a higher chance of occurring when he was around. I guess I have fated to thank for being stuck with unuseful aspects. Getting the weirdest, most useless aspect definitely counts as improbable. Sonny reasoned that his other two aspects, Mark of Divinity and Child of Shadows, must be linked to his role as a temple slave. Mark of Divinity theoretically came with some solid perks. It could be used to enhance several types of sorcery and allow access to certain sacred places inside the Dream Realm. Unfortunately, there were no sacred places in sight, and Sonny's aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, so it was useless too. Sonny's third aspect perplexed him. He had never heard of Child of Shadows before, and the attribute description didn't give much indication of any practical effects it might have. Soon, the sun began to dip behind the mountain, and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sonny found himself able to see perfectly in the darkness. This had to be related to his Child of the Shadows attribute. This ability didn't provide any immediate hints toward escaping, but it was nothing to scoff at. Maybe the shadows would reward him with some other yet unknown gifts. Finally, something good. I wonder if I can... The leader soldier's voice boomed.
Stop the caravan. Prepare to camp.
Following the head soldier's order, the slaves stopped and fell to the ground, shivering and exhausted. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat protected from the wind by a protruding mass of rock, but it was still too cold to rest with ease. The soldiers got busy, herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth, and lighting up a large bonfire in the center of the camp. Although not before tending to their horses, the heavy wagon to which the main chain was firmly affixed was pushed forward to block the wind. While looking around, Sonny noticed the young soldier from before watching the mountain with a complicated look on his face. Sonny rolled his eyes. What a weirdo. Soon, the bonfire was blazing. The stronger slaves tried to find their way closer to the fire, while the weaker ones, like Sonny, were forced to sit at the outer end of the circle, with their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was encumbered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain. That's why the familiar broad-shouldered slave ended up just where he started, despite all of his efforts to get closer to the flame.
Damn Imperials,
he hissed, clearly irritated. The soldiers walked among the slaves, portioning out water and food. Sonny, just like everybody else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of rock-hard moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing look, he forced himself to eat the whole thing, just to be left as hungry as he was before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave that had been walking behind him looked around in anguish. By all the gods, they used to feed me better even in the dungeons. He spat on the ground, desperate. And most of us innocent men in the dungeon were there waiting to visit the gallows, too. A few steps away from them, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries were growing from the snow. Sonny had noticed them before, clustering here and there along the road, and even noted how pretty those resilient things looked, contrasted against the white. The shifty slave's eyes glistened as he tried to crawl toward the berries on all fours. I would advise against eating those, friend. It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sonny turned around and finally saw him in the flesh. He was a tall man in his 40s, lean and scraggly, handsome, with a dignified look of a scholar. How a man such as him ended up a slave was a mystery, yet there he was. The shifty slave scowled. You always have something to say, don't you? Why should I listen to you? The scholar smiled apologetically. Those berries are called bloodbane. They grow in the places where human blood was spilled. That's why there's always a lot of them along the slave trade routes. The shifty slave rolled his eyes. So what? The older man sighed. Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man. The shifty slave flinched back and glared at the scholar.
Curses!
The slave's dispute was lost on Sonny, who had an uneasy feeling in his stomach. As he looked around the camp, he recognized the markings on the mountain walls. This is where he had seen the visions of slaughtered corpses when he first started the nightmare. His stomach turned. As he closed his eyes, he could still see the mounds of cracked and shattered bones peeking out through the snow. He felt a chill run through his bones. This was where they were going to die. Sonny spun around in a panic, anxious to see if he could see some sort of nightmare creature waiting to devour them all. His chains rattled and pulled taut. He realized even if he saw the monster coming, he would be powerless to fight or flee. He was a sitting duck. As if on cue, there was a thunderous roar from above them in the mountains. The soldiers and other slaves stirred, realizing for the first time they were in grave danger. But it was too late. A massive dark form came crashing from the sky. Sonny yanked at his chains, trying to weasel away, but the being was falling at them way too fast.